I've never been an Android guy, so I have no idea about you Android people. I've always had an iPhone, and one of the things that I know about iPhones, in fact, Apple products in general, is that they love to be turned off. Because if you turn off an iPhone, it completely resets it. And I know this last week, it just seemed like there was something wrong with my phone. It was sluggish, a couple of apps would not open, and it just was not working right. And I was like, oh, when was the last time I turned my phone off? I'm like, oh, I don't even remember. So I powered it off, powered it back on again, and everything worked great. iPhones love to be turned off because they reset themselves in that few moments. And it got me thinking about how there are so many things as I look around in my life and just in the world in general. There's so many things that need to be reset. They started out well, but time goes and they get glitchy, or they just go awry. And there's so many things I can think of that aren't working exactly right. And then as I was thinking about this passage, I was thinking that one of the things that Jesus came to do was to reset everything. Because God created everything good. A lot of things have gotten a little bit glitchy. Some things are just broken, and what Jesus is in the process of doing is resetting it so that we can get back to the way that things are supposed to be. So in our new sermon series on Rediscovering Jesus, we're going to look at the things that Jesus does, who Jesus is. And there are all sorts of ideas about Jesus, like from Jesus is a good teacher to Jesus is God. A belief on the continuum of Jesus is kind of the patron saint of some people to Jesus is the savior of the entire world. From Jesus is somebody who just wants to be your buddy to someone who will challenge you beyond anything you could imagine or think. From someone who basically has just come to punish people to someone who comes to extend grace and love. So we're going to take about 6 weeks to rediscover who Jesus was. And so we're going to start with what Jesus said about himself. We're going to go to a relatively familiar passage out of Luke chapter 4. And just for context, what's going on here is this is the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. So, he's born and he grows up, and then he is tempted by Satan, which is right before this. He's baptized. And then as he kind of wanders back up to Nazareth, where he's from, he's kind of teaching in synagogues along the way. But this is really Jesus' big debut above his public ministry. So this is important. Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 22. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. So this is the beginning of Jesus laying out what it is he's going to be doing. So he reads this passage from Isaiah 61, a prophecy from like 600 years beforehand. And basically what Jesus is saying is this thing that you've been thinking about, this thing that you've been hoping for and dreaming of, it's happening now, and I'm the one who's doing it. And this work that God is doing among you, first and foremost, is good news. And why is that? Because things need to change. Because things are broken. Because people are suffering. People are oppressed. People are just struggling to get the basic things they need to live. Like buying eggs. So really, nobody shops. And really, can I just say this? Can I just be honest with you? It does not help me if afterwards you come up and go, "I was laughing on the inside." That really means nothing to me. So for all of these things that are going awry, for them to be fixed is good news or gospel, because that's the literal meaning of gospel. Gospel means good news. So when Jesus is announcing what he's come to do, it is good news, because God in Christ is in the process of changing things and making them right. It's the great reset. We're going back to the way things were supposed to be. God's working to make them that way again. And then let's talk about some of the things that Jesus is resetting. So in verse 18, he starts with, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." The first thing just to acknowledge is that this is a God movement. This is the heart of God. This is what God is about. This is just fundamental. And one of the first things that he addresses is proclaiming good news to the poor. The poor are on God's heart. Now, my very favorite theologian, I like him better than N.T. Wright. I like him better than St. Augustine. My very favorite theologian is Tevye the Milkman. And in Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye says this truism: there's no shame in being poor, but it's no great honor either. And God knows that. And God is concerned for the poor. Why? Why is God so concerned for the poor? Because fundamentally, God has come to help people who need help. And the poor need help. But, you say, didn't Jesus say, "The poor you will always have with you"? Yes. And if Jesus said that, isn't he basically saying, there are so many poor people? There will always be poor people. So don't worry about it, because you're never going to be able to do anything about it. I mean, that's kind of how we take it. But that's not what Jesus is saying. Because what Jesus is doing is he's giving half a quote. You know, like if I were to say, early to bed, early to rise, you would all be able to finish that Benjamin Franklin quote. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is not saying, gosh, there are so many pesky poor people, you can't even begin to address that. Jesus is quoting from Deuteronomy 15. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. The force of that is entirely different. It's not, there will always be poor people, there's nothing you can do about it. The force of it is, there's always going to be somebody that you can help. So be available to help. The posture is not, there's nothing I can do. The posture is, in this situation, how can I help? So in Christ, someone has come to help the poor. And poor, at this point in time, is a really broad category. When we think of poor, we basically mean people who don't have any money. But in the biblical times, it meant more than that. It did mean people who didn't have very much money. But it also was a very broad category that included people of low social status, people who live on a lower socioeconomic bracket than you do. And we all, I mean, most of us wouldn't say this, but we all have a hierarchy of professions in our mind. And if you have kids, you know, when your daughter's going to come home with a boy, you have an idea of where on that, profession list you would like him to be. Because we think that some are higher than others. And every once in a while in the past, I have given an example of things that are lower than others. And afterwards, somebody will come to me every time. Someone will come to me and say, you really shouldn't denigrate that person because they have worth and value too. And I'm like, you didn't listen to what I said, but it's very painful to me, so I'm not going to say that again. But we all have those things where we believe that certain professions are higher than others and certain professions are lower than others. It also includes people who are social outsiders. It could be people who are different from us. It could be people who are just a little bit quirky. It could be people that require a little extra grace. It's the people that you would not invite for Thanksgiving dinner if they weren't your relatives. It extends to social outcasts. It extends to people who have made bad life decisions. People who have done dumb stuff. That's all in the poor. So it is especially good news for those people and people like that. Now, many of you have stories. Many of you have been to Bible camp in Alaska, or have served at the Northwest Furniture Bank, or will serve at the Northwest Furniture Bank next week. Or you've been out to Evergreen Elementary School, or in other places where you have helped. And you have seen people who are not like you. And you know the pain of watching people who are living in abject poverty or generational poverty. You've seen them struggle. You know what it's like watching people who have made really, really bad choices and continue to make really bad choices. And then all of a sudden you have this moment of clarity and you go, nobody ever taught them to make a good choice. They've never seen a good choice. And you know how your heart goes out to people like that and how it can all be overwhelming. And many of you in those situations and in other situations like that have been the expression of Jesus' love to people who really need help. You are part of Jesus resetting things in people's lives and in the world. Jesus goes on to say, he sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners. The better word there is captives, because it means captive on a number of different levels. It could be a prisoner. It could be someone who is in jail. But there is an element of injustice. There's like people who are unjustly imprisoned. So there's that. And the reason I think that comes up particularly in that day and age is that their penal system was very, very different from ours. And we get a great insight into this if you read Paul's letters when he was in prison, because he asks his friends for certain things. He's like, hey, would somebody bring me a coat? Why does Paul need a coat? Because they won't give you one in a Roman prison in 00. There is no heat. If you don't have a coat, you will freeze to death. Paul writes and asks for money. Paul writes and thanks people for sending him gifts. Why does he need money? He's in prison because it doesn't include food. If you don't have somebody that will bring you food, you will just starve to death. And so who knows how many thousands of people were imprisoned in Roman prisons in 00 who were just put into prison and they died just from lack of care. This passage includes those people. But even if there isn't an element of injustice, even if it's people who deserve to be in prison, grace extends even to them. And this is an important note for us because I think it's very easy to look at some people and think they're getting what they deserve. There are consequences to your actions, folks. You do something bad, you deserve that consequence. But the very bedrock of our faith, we sang about it, Brendan read about it, is that we get grace instead of what we deserve. And so that's good news for people who are suffering the consequences of their own actions. I think about the people in our congregation who year in and year out, no lie, for years have gone up to the women's prison in the north of Gig Harbor and go in there and remind those women that they have worth, they have value, they matter. And that's good news. That's gospel. There's also people who are captive to their addictions and other bondages. I think of all the parents and grandparents and spouses and friends that I know who are agonizing over somebody that they love who is struggling with an addiction. I think of all the people who have said, I could quit if I really want to, but apparently can't. I think about all the people that I know who've just given up on ever being able to get on top of that addiction or that bondage. And I think about Celebrate Recovery, the ministry that we host on Monday nights. And I think about other people that are involved with helping people who are addicted. And those of you who are in recovery, you are experiencing the resetting of Jesus. And those of you who are mentors, those of you who are sponsors, those of you who are walking alongside people that are struggling with addiction are doing the work of Jesus and reminding people that they can be reset. Jesus goes on to talk about recovery of sight for the blind. And there's several meanings for this. The first and obvious one is physical healing for people who are literally blind. And in our in our context, I mean, being blind is really, really difficult. Being blind 2,000 years ago is practically a death sentence. It's the hope that even something like that, that there is hope that it can be changed. It can also mean people who can't see reality, whether because of pain of the past that they're carrying, whether because of delusion, whether of wrong thinking or whatever. I mean, sometimes the pain that we're walking through is so deep that all we can see is that. And we need somebody else to come alongside us and remind us that God still has a plan and God still has a purpose for us. And that is, I think, what Paul is talking about when he says, we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see face to face. We can be reminded that God is present. We can see that. So there's the potential of healing. There's the potential of wholeness. And those of you who are helping people see clearly are doing the work of Jesus, resetting people and resetting the world. And that's why it's so critical to know who Jesus is and to present him correctly, because the knowledge of Jesus is always good news. And then he goes on to set the oppressed free. I am learning that one of the deep things that people who are suffering under oppression need is to be seen. And it's really easy to toss around words like oppression. I really don't see that much oppression. Most of us don't see very much oppression. But there are people groups around the world who are suffering severe oppression. I think about, and it's almost always women, that I run across who are in an oppressive or an abusive relationship. One of the things that has most scarred me that I have never been able to forget is driving into a parking lot one day and just happening to look over to my left and seeing some dude holding his wife by the throat and just pounding on her face just over and over and over. And Jesus wants people like that to know that they're seen and that they don't have to stay in that relationship, that their oppression can be changed. I think about children in our schools or children that we know who, unlike your kids, when they go home for Christmas break, just dread what's going to happen to them because they'll be alone with their families and not safe for 2 weeks. Jesus coming is good news to them. And many of you are working in those situations, helping to bring freedom to people who are oppressed. And then in verse 19, and this is really the whole guiding thing, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus is ushering in a new time. It's something that they've been waiting for, and Jesus is like, and here it is. And the theological construct that stands behind all of this, it isn't easy for us to see because it's fairly obscure in the Old Testament, but would have been right here for them, is the concept of the year of Jubilee. Their time was divided up into 7-year sections, and in the 7th year, the next year was the year of Jubilee. And what happened in the year of Jubilee was everything went back to its rightful owner. So if you had sold property, the year of Jubilee, it returns back to you. If you had sold yourself into slavery to pay a debt, the year of Jubilee, you were set free. And so it's this idea of everything that is now under the power of a different owner in the year of Jubilee returns back to its rightful owner. We belong now to the realm of sin and pain and death. We're bound in many ways by the principalities and the powers of the air. But Jesus' year of Jubilee reminds us that we're being returned to God. We're being returned to the place where we should be, to our rightful owner, if you will. So Jesus lists all of these things that he's come to do, and he's like, yep, it's the year of Jubilee. And one of the reasons that I know that he is emphasizing this good news, this thing about being set free, is that he doesn't finish the quote from Isaiah 61. In fact, when I tell you this, you'll see it and you'll be like, I never saw that before. Because it says that he comes to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and then he rolls up the scroll of Isaiah. But there's more. He stops on purpose to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. That's not what he's here to announce. And so he on purpose rolls the scroll up at that point, just so that we can be reminded that he's here to proclaim God's favor, the year of Jubilee. And Jesus then rolls up the scroll, because that's the sum total of what he came to do. He knows what he's here to do, and he knows what he wasn't called to do. He wasn't called to lead an armed revolt. He wasn't called to reestablish pure worship in the temple. He wasn't called to write a manual on Christian living and church conflict. And you see that then if you walk through the Gospels, that people will come up to Jesus and Jesus will go, sorry, I'm not here for you. Or people will have this bright idea of something that Jesus should do, and Jesus would be like, yeah, that's not what I'm here for. And then it ends with something that doesn't come across really well in English. All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son, they asked? Amazed at his gracious words, it's actually better translated as appalled. They were appalled at his gracious words. Why? Because they thought he was tossing grace around too liberally. It was too much grace given to all the wrong people. And I thought, if I ever wanted to have a life motto, too much grace for all the wrong people, wouldn't be a bad life motto. And you'll see that Jesus will deal with that the rest of his life. Jesus, you shouldn't be extending grace to those people. Jesus, you shouldn't be hanging around those people. Jesus, you shouldn't be doing that stuff with those people. Too much grace will always be challenging for people. And that's why in this account then, they began to use their questions to avoid the message. See, it wasn't like, isn't that Joseph's kid? How about that? Hometown kid done well. It's more like, isn't that Joseph's kid? I used to change his diapers. Why should I pay attention to him? That's the force of it. And then the next thing that happens is they take him out and try and throw him off of a cliff. Too much grace was too challenging for them. It's interesting to me, though, that Jesus begins his ministry with these emphases, and then at the very end of his ministry, he returns to it again. Listen to some of the words from Matthew 25. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. These are, because he begins and ends his ministry with this thing. I mean, this is a huge clue, folks, that this is the stuff that is important to Jesus. And he ends with, and it should be important to you. And so I've given so many examples all the way through the sermon of ways that we as a church and many of you as individuals have demonstrated that the priorities of God are also important to us. So let me ask you 3 questions. First, what area of your life needs to be reset? Number 2, what is the biggest piece of good news for you? And number 3, who are you tempted to believe doesn't deserve God's grace?
Hi, thanks for watching. The people of Harbor Covenant Church really want you to know the love that God has for you, want to grow with you in faith, and want to serve alongside you, not only to help others do the same, but also to make our families and our communities better. If that sounds like something that you can get on board with, then like, follow, and drop us a comment in the video. Watch some more videos on our channel or come visit us on Sunday. You can find out more about Harbor Covenant Church at harborcov.church.